name is Jenna Albright, and this is my EDT 6010 video for my flipped classroom. The topic in 6th grade is ratios, and these are the two essential questions that we're going to be focusing on throughout my lesson here. Now, how can you represent a relationship between two quantities? How can you find two ratios that describe the same relationship? Those are going to be the two focuses that we talk about throughout these lessons to help us prepare for class tomorrow. Here we go. Again, this is a topic for ratios and rates. We're going to focus just on ratios. And this is for a 6th grade math lesson, and here are our Common Core standards to hit. Let's take a look at some vocabulary words. One definition is a comparison of two quantities. Can be part to part to whole, or whole to part comparisons. Now this definition can be matched with the word ratio. Now, two ratios that describe the same relationship are blank, and that is equivalent ratios. So we're going to be learning about ratios and ways to represent them, and we're also going to be talking about equivalent ratios and how we can organize them. To touch on some things that you might have learned before, let's take a look at this table, one that you might have seen in previous school years, like 5th grade. Now here's one column, our x values, 1, 3, 5, and 7. They are increasing by 2. For our y values, we have 2, 6, and 10, and those are increasing by 4. Now, we would identify the pattern to be able to fill in this missing piece. Since this side is increasing by 4, I would know that my next value after 10 would be 14. We're going to build on our knowledge with tables and see how that relates to our ratios unit. But first, let's start with part 1, ratio. A ratio, again, is a comparison of two quantities, and it can be part to part to whole, or whole to part comparisons. Let's look at some notes or some examples. Here we go. So a part to part comparison is squares to circles in this representation. We have 3 squares to 2 circles. We can represent that comparison using a colon. We can also write it as a fraction, and we can also use the word to. If a question ever asks you to explain the ratio, this is how we would explain what the ratio means. For every 3 squares, there are 2 circles. Another comparison that we may use is a part to whole. For instance, in this comparison, we have circles to shapes. Now up here there are 2 circles to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 total shapes. So we would represent that 2 to 5. Now notice, even though these two are comparing 2 different things, we can represent the comparison in all of the same ways, just using the different number quantities. Let's look at this example. If there are 3 baseball bats and a total of 12 baseballs, then the ratio compares the baseball bats to baseballs. We can write that by 3 to 12. We can write it as a colon. We can also write it as a fraction. And finally, we can write it with the word to. Now, we're not always going to be asked to write a sentence to describe the ratio. This is going to be one of many quick methods to describe the two quantities. All right, the second part. 2 ratios that describe the same relationship are equivalent ratios. You can find equivalent ratios by adding or subtracting quantities in equivalent ratios, or multiplying or dividing each quantity in a ratio by the same number, kind of like equivalent fractions, since we can represent our ratios as a fraction. Now, you can find and organize equivalent ratios in ratio tables. Let's take a look at an example. So we're going to drag the correct number into the chart to see if we found the correct pattern. Now, these are tables that are very similar, probably ones that you have seen before. Now, this is a ratio, or a comparison. We're comparing 1 boy to 5 girls. And we can write that in the same ways that we wrote in the beginning. 1 to 5, 1 to 5, or like a fraction, 1 to 5. help us find the missing piece, notice there's a missing value right here, we need to look at multiplication within the table, just like finding an equivalent fraction. So I like to think of ratio tables as representing our ratio with a fraction. I even draw the little bar here to help me when I'm thinking about increasing and finding an equivalent ratio. So to get from 5 to 10, all we are doing is multiplying by 2. Because we did that to our denominator, or in our bottom section of our table, we need to do that also in our numerator, times 2. And 1 times 2 is 2. So we can drag our response of 2 into our box. Let's look at one more example. Violins to cellos. We have 8 violins to 3 cellos. I'm going to go ahead and draw my fraction bar because that's how I like to think of ratios. Now we're going to look at the multiplication to fill in the missing piece as we did over here. 8 times 3 will get me to 24. So I need to do 3 times 3 to keep my ratio equivalent and make sure we are comparing the right number of things. And that is an N. All right. Okay, so to highlight a few takeaways from today's lesson to help you prepare for tomorrow's class. We have a ratio is a comparison of two quantities, and of course it can be represented in many ways. And equivalent ratios are two ratios that describe the same relationship, and we also talked about how we can really write those using a ratio table. Which brings me to here. Ways to represent ratios. We can use visuals, and we can use ratio tables. Thank you.